invoice entry icon is where invoices are generated from receipts that have already been posted. Invoices entered and posted appear in accounts payable so they can be paid. Enter the invoice number in the invoice number field. To recall a previously posted invoice, enter or select from the Finder. To enter an invoice in purchase orders, the receipt needs to first be posted. Either enter the receipt number in the receipt number field or use the Finder to locate it. The vendor attached to this receipt appears in the vendor number field at the top of the window. To verify the vendor address information or to create a single invoice for multiple posted receipts, enter or select the vendor number before selecting the receipt number. To prevent the invoice from being paid in accounts payable, select the On Hold field. The system defaults to the date Accpac was started for the invoice date. This date, of course, can be any date, past or future. The date entered determines the fiscal year and period the journal entries are posted in General Ledger. Accpac then displays the purchase order number associated with the invoice being entered. If a single receipt was created earlier from multiple purchase orders, the first purchase order selected appears here. The Invoice Total field displays the amount of the invoice as calculated from the receipt. If the invoice amount is different than the posted receipt, you need to enter the correct invoice amount here and then correct the area that is wrong. It could be a cost change since the receipt was entered, or possibly an additional cost that has changed or been added. Let's assume an additional cost is going to be added, so change the invoice amount total to $1,261.11. If remit to locations were defined for the vendor, enter or select the address to use. To verify that the correct address has been selected for payment, click the zoom blue up arrow. Then optionally select or enter the bill to address where the invoice is sent for payment. Optionally, enter any description or reference information. The lower portion of the window displays the items and field values from the receipt or receipts that are selected. Enter or accept yes in the Fully Invoiced field if the detail line is to be fully invoiced. If the quantity invoiced equals the quantity received for the detail, yes is the default. If the quantity invoiced is less than the quantity received, because you may possibly be expecting more items, the default is no. If no more items are expected, or if you are invoicing the quantity you have received to date, enter yes. Accpac displays the item number and description for those items that have been received, and then the location code from the receipt. Accept or enter the quantity to be invoiced. Accpac defaults to the quantity from the receipt. Normally, this is the quantity to be invoiced, but possibly the wrong quantity was entered on the receipt, or you are invoicing for more or less items than received. One word of caution here: if the quantity being entered is different than the default, be sure to enter the quantity in the unit of measure field here. This field cannot be changed. Accpac defaults to the cost entered on the receipt for the unit of measure. If the user has the appropriate security rights, the cost can be changed, but be sure to enter the cost correctly associated with the unit of measure. If a discount for the item existed on the receipt, the discount entered defaults here. Enter or change the discount percent or amount if necessary. If tax was factored into the cost of the item on the receipt, the tax amount is displayed next. Optionally change the tax settings by clicking the Item Tax button. Once again, Accpac displays the net of tax extended amount, factoring any taxes. The next field is the weight unit of measure. If weight is assigned to the item in inventory control, Accpac displays the weight unit of measure and the weight of the item. The extended weight is calculated by multiplying the quantity by the unit weight. If a vendor unique item number existed on the receipt, that item number appears here. Next, the system displays the sales order number entered on the receipt. If no sales order number exists, and it is known upon entering the invoice now that the receipt of this item satisfies a sales order, enter the sales order number. Although the received item could be needed for multiple sales orders, only one can be entered. If the item on the invoice is non-stock, the expense account field displays the general ledger account from the receipt. In addition, if the item is non-stock, the non-stock clearing account entered on the receipt appears. The receipt number field displays the receipt number where the item detail originated. This is useful if you are combining more than one receipt on the invoice, using the From Multiple Receipts option. The manufacturer's item number is displayed next if one was entered earlier on the receipt or purchase order. The Optional Fields field is where optional fields specific to this item detail are entered. Optional fields assigned to the invoice as a whole are entered using the Optional Fields page. Optional fields are discussed in a later session. And finally, discountable. This setting indicates if the cost of the item is discountable towards any vendor term discounts. So, if the vendor provides a 2% discount for this item, if the invoice is paid within 10 days, and the appropriate terms code is used on the terms page, entering or selecting yes here indicates that this item qualifies. Although Accpac automatically calculates tax when necessary based on the tax settings established with the vendor and item, the Item Tax button is used to view or change the item side of the tax settings. As discussed earlier, tax settings should be made if the vendor-item combination for this particular purchase needs to be calculated differently from the default settings for this particular purchase. The Item Tax button also allows the Container section of the window to appear as one screen, so all the fields can be observed without having to scroll left and right. In the event any tax settings are adjusted for the item while entering the invoice, click the Calculate Taxes button to have the system recalculate the new tax values. The Taxes page displays the tax settings for the vendor's side of the tax calculation process. As discussed earlier, calculating taxes in purchase orders observes two components: whether the specific item is taxable and if the vendor is taxable. Purchase orders refers to the tax matrix in Common Services discussed in the System Manager section of this course to determine if the item-vendor combination is taxable or not, and if it is, what the tax rate is. The item side of the matrix is determined on the Details tab using the Item Tax button, where the Taxes page here determines the vendor side of the tax calculation. The tax settings shown on this window default from how they were accepted on the receipt. Make changes to the tax settings on this window if this particular invoice requires a tax override. Then click the Calculate Taxes button to recalculate the tax amount. The Terms page determines any vendor term discounts provided for this invoice. Term discounts default from the vendor profile in accounts payable or from the template code if one was used. If the vendor provides a discount, such as a 2% off if the invoice is paid within 10 days, the 2% off qualifies for all detail lines on the invoice page where yes is specified in the discountable field. Although the term code defaults from the vendor or template, the code can be changed for this invoice. Changing the term code only affects this invoice. The term code displays the final due date, a discount date, if one applies, and what the discount percent or amount is. A term code percent or amount override can also be directly entered. The Additional Cost page is where non-specific inventory expenses are entered that the vendor is charging. For example, expenses such as shipping or handling fees that may or may not be factored into the cost of the items being received. Any additional costs entered on the receipt appear as the default. Existing details can be changed and/or new charges can be entered. To enter a new additional cost, within the Container section, click the Insert key. Enter or select the additional cost, then enter the additional cost amount. When additional costs are added in the Setup section of purchase orders, item taxes are established. These default settings appear for the additional cost being selected. Making changes to how tax is calculated can be done by selecting the Cost Tax button. If any changes are made, click the Calculate Taxes button to update the window. As discussed in the Receipts section of this training, Accpac provides several ways to prorate the additional cost. No proration indicates to directly expense the additional cost to the expense account entered in this field. Prorate by quantity prorates the additional cost amount by the percentage of the quantity of the item against the quantity total for all items being received. Prorate by cost prorates the amount of the additional cost by the cost percentage of the item against the entire cost of all items being received. Prorate by weight prorates the additional cost by the weight of the specific item against the weight of all items being received. And the Prorate Manually option allows you to manually enter the allocation amounts for each item upon the receipt being entered. If this is selected, the Distribute Proration field becomes available. Distribute the additional cost amount, shown in the top right corner of the window, to the desired item. The total allocation amount for all items must match the total additional cost amount. As discussed in the Receipts section, the Reproration Method field determines what should happen if any of the items on this invoice are returned to the vendor in the future. The Leave option keeps the allocated amount with the item number and distributes it among the other items, where the Prorate option takes the additional cost amount that was allocated to the item when it was received and distributes it to the other items, if any, that were on the original receipt. The Expense option expenses the allocated additional cost directly to the return account listed here, if an item is returned later from this receipt. Then optionally enter any reference or comments regarding the additional cost, and view the receipt number where the additional cost originated, if this invoice was generated from multiple receipts. The Optional Fields field is where optional field values are assigned to the additional cost on a line-by-line basis. And finally, if the additional cost applies toward any vendor term discounts, as discussed earlier. The Optional Fields page displays any optional fields assigned to the invoice header section. Optional fields are discussed in a later session. If multi-currency is installed and configured for the database, a rates page is available. This is where changes can be made to the exchange rate information if the vendor's source currency is different than the company's functional currency. Optionally change the rate type, date associated with the exchange rate, or the actual rate itself. The Totals page displays the Invoice Totals window. Optionally enter an overall comment that prints on the invoice and observe the total weight of the items on the invoice for those items where weight was entered. Also observe the invoice subtotal, any entered discounts, the calculated tax amount, and the invoice total. The bottom portion of the window contains another row of buttons that are visible from any page. Click the Post button when the invoice is ready to be posted. As discussed earlier, the History button inquires on previous purchases for the item-vendor combination with the ability to further drill down into the details of a particular document to view its contents. When the invoice is complete, click the Post button to post it. You then have the option to print the invoice immediately or save it so it can be printed later.
Let's take a look at return entry.